The story of Clara, from bullying victim to international speaker. Clara grew up in a small suburban neighborhood, the kind where everyone knows each other and children are expected to follow a certain mold: cheerful, outgoing, obedient. From the outside, she seemed like a regular kid, quiet, bookish, and always found in the back row of the classroom, scribbling in her notebook or gazing out the window. But unlike many of her classmates, Clara was intensely introspective. She wasn't shy so much as she was observant, a child who preferred to listen rather than speak, to think rather than perform. From a young age, Clara noticed the difference between her and others. While most of the kids in her class thrived on attention and social games, Clara felt more at home with her thoughts. Her imagination was vast, filled with worlds and stories she kept hidden from everyone. Her parents, both working long hours, praised her for being low maintenance. She didn't complain, didn't demand much, didn't cause trouble. But what no one realized was that she was beginning to internalize a sense of invisibility. She started to believe that maybe she was supposed to be overlooked. As she entered middle school, that quiet nature became a target. New environments, new students, and growing social hierarchies quickly placed Clara at the bottom. She didn't understand the rules of popularity, didn't have the right clothes, didn't know how to make her voice heard. But before the bullying began, Clara was still hopeful that maybe one day people would see the value in who she truly was. This is the story of how that hope was crushed, and later, how she rebuilt herself from the ruins. But to understand her transformation, we must begin here, with the young girl sitting silently at her desk, unnoticed and underestimated, already carrying a world inside her, not yet knowing she would one day stand in front of thousands and speak. The onset of bullying and the emotional toll it took. It started subtly, a snicker when Clara answered a question in class, a wrong outfit that led to whispers behind her back. At first, she brushed it off, thinking maybe she was imagining things. But it escalated quickly. In the cafeteria, her seat would mysteriously be taken every day. In group projects, she was always the one left out, the extra piece no one wanted to deal with. Eventually, the whispers turned into taunts, and the exclusion became deliberate. Middle school can be a brutal landscape for someone who doesn't quite fit in. Clara wasn't prepared for the way her silence would be used against her. Her intelligence, once a source of pride, became ammunition, teacher's pet, they called her. Her quietness, labeled as weird. Her uniqueness, distorted into something shameful. The bullying wasn't just verbal. Notes would be left in her locker, cruel messages scribbled hastily but deliberately. Her backpack would be kicked in the hallway. Rumors spread, things she never said, things she never did. It wasn't just one person, it was a culture of casual cruelty. But what made it worse was the way the adults didn't seem to notice. Teachers overlooked the subtle digs, assuming Clara was just sensitive. Her parents, wrapped up in their own stress, thought she was just going through a phase. And so Clara learned to carry it all, the shame, the fear, the isolation, in silence. The emotional toll was immense. Clara, once imaginative and quietly confident, began to fade. She stopped writing. She avoided eye contact. Her grades slipped. She dreaded waking up in the morning. Her internal world, once vivid and full of life, started to feel like a cage. She began to question her worth, her identity, even her place in the world. This wasn't just bullying. It was a dismantling of a young person's spirit. But what Clara didn't know then was that the pain she was experiencing would one day become the foundation of her greatest strength. First, though, she had to endure it. She had to survive it. The breaking point, when Clara couldn't pretend anymore. There comes a moment in some people's lives when the emotional weight they've been carrying becomes too heavy to mask. For Clara, that moment came on a rainy Tuesday morning in the school library, a place that once offered refuge but had begun to feel just as hostile as the rest of the building. She was sitting in the back corner, pretending to read while quietly wiping tears that refused to stop. Her body was present, but her mind was fraying at the edges. The night before, someone had created a fake social media account using her name, posting embarrassing, fabricated things. The comments were cruel, and the likes just made it worse. The betrayal stung more than usual this time, because it meant someone had taken the time to digitally recreate her just to ruin her further. Something snapped. That morning, Clara didn't have the strength to fake a smile or pretend everything was okay. When the librarian casually asked, "Everything all right, sweetie?" a question Clara had always responded to with a robotic yes, she finally said no, and then she broke down. The tears came fast, uncontrollable. Years of silence poured out all at once. The librarian knelt beside her, stunned. For the first time, someone saw Clara, not the quiet girl, not the loner, but the human being beneath the armor of indifference. This wasn't just sadness. It was accumulated pain, shame, humiliation, fear. Her world had become too small, too dark. She didn't want to disappear, but she didn't know how to exist anymore. This moment, painful and raw, marked a crucial turning point. Not because things magically got better the next day, but because Clara had finally broken the silence. The act of admitting she was not okay took more courage than anyone around her could possibly know. It was the first honest step toward reclaiming her identity. In many ways, breakdowns are misunderstood. They are not always signs of weakness. Sometimes, they are the body and soul's way of demanding change. That was true for Clara. Her breaking point became her breaking open, a crack in the facade that would eventually allow light to come in. The first spark, meeting someone who believed in her. In the wake of her breakdown, Clara was referred to the school counselor, a woman named Julia who would go on to play a pivotal role in Clara's transformation. At first, Clara was reluctant. She showed up to their sessions guarded, speaking in short sentences, eyes always lowered. She was so used to being ignored or mocked that she assumed this would be no different, another adult checking a box. But Julia didn't treat her like a case. She treated her like a person. During their early conversations, Julia didn't push. She listened, and when Clara did begin to talk, even a little, Julia remembered every detail. She remembered the names Clara mentioned. She followed up on things that mattered. She created space without pressure. And slowly, Clara began to feel something she hadn't felt in years, seen. One afternoon, after weeks of quiet progress, Julia said something that Clara would never forget. "You know, I think you have something powerful to say. Maybe one day people will listen." Clara didn't respond out loud, but those words hit her like lightning. No one had ever suggested she had value beyond surviving. No one had ever planted the idea that her voice could be heard, let alone respected. That comment lingered with her, quietly taking root. It was the first time someone dared to imagine a future version of Clara who wasn't broken, who wasn't just enduring, but thriving. For a teenager drowning in silence and self-doubt, one person believing in her was a lifeline. And it was enough to spark the idea that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over. What made Julia different wasn't just kindness, it was the belief that Clara didn't need to be fixed. She needed to be reminded of who she was before the world told her otherwise. This moment didn't solve everything. But it did something more important. It introduced a possibility. And that's where all transformation begins. Turning pain into power, Clara's first small victory. For weeks, Clara had clung to Julia's words like a secret flame. Maybe one day, people will listen. That single sentence replayed in her mind during sleepless nights and silent bus rides. It didn't erase her scars, but it gave her a reason to look beyond them. One day, Julia gave Clara a small but terrifying assignment. Write down one thing she wished someone had told her during her worst moment. Clara stared at the blank page for hours. Her hand trembled as she held the pen. But slowly, almost painfully, she began to write. The words were jagged at first, awkward, messy, but they were hers. She wrote about loneliness, about the cruel laughter in hallways, about the shame that clung to her like a second skin. But she also wrote a line that surprised even herself. "You are not what they say you are." That sentence felt like oxygen. It didn't come from Julia. It didn't come from anyone else. It came from Clara. And when she read it aloud during their next session, Julia smiled, not with pride, but with recognition. "That," Julia said gently, "is your voice." This moment marked a shift. For the first time, Clara realized she could create meaning from what she had endured. Her pain wasn't just suffering, it was raw material. And if she was brave enough, she could shape it into something honest, something real, something useful. She began journaling regularly, not as homework, but as survival. The page became a place where her voice had power, It was her territory, her truth. And slowly, her confidence began to grow, not because she was better, but because she was finally becoming. That first small victory, writing a sentence that challenged her entire belief system, didn't fix everything. But it proved one crucial thing. Clara had something inside her that the world hadn't destroyed. Not yet. And if she protected that ember, maybe it could become a flame. The first step into the public eye, sharing her story anonymously. Clara's hands hovered over her keyboard. Her heart raced. She had rewritten the post more than 20 times. Erased paragraphs. Added lines. Cried. Deleted everything again. It wasn't the fear of writing. She had been journaling for months now. It was the fear of being seen. Julia had encouraged her gently. You don't have to use your name. Just try letting your story exist somewhere beyond the page. It seemed like a small step, but for Clara, it felt monumental. To share her experience, even anonymously, was to give the world a piece of herself. A piece that had only known judgment and cruelty. But late one night, after hours of battling doubt and self-sabotage, she pressed post on an online support forum for survivors of bullying. She expected silence. Instead, she got something she never anticipated: connection. Strangers responded with kindness. One person wrote, "I thought I was alone in this. Your words made me feel understood." Another said, "Thank you for your honesty. I wish I'd read this when I was 14. Clara sat there, stunned. For years, her story had been a source of shame. But now that same story, unchanged, was helping people. Healing people. Guiding them through the dark the same way she had once stumbled through it alone. That was the first time she understood the quiet power of vulnerability. When you speak your truth, you give others permission to feel theirs. Over the next few weeks, Clara continued to write. Short posts, journal entries, responses to others. Always anonymously. But something had shifted. She no longer saw her past as a wound to hide. She began to see it as a message she could offer, like a lighthouse built from bricks of pain. The anonymity gave her courage. But more than that, the impact gave her purpose. She realized something profound. Her voice mattered. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And that truth, whispered behind a username and a screen, was the first brick in the foundation of a future Clara never thought she deserved, one where she would be heard. Finding her voice, the first time she spoke in front of a crowd. The first time Clara stood in front of a crowd, her knees trembled. Her palms were cold and damp, gripping the sides of the podium like a life raft. The microphone in front of her looked far too official, far too serious. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, not like this. Not by choice. The auditorium was small. Maybe 30 people, students, teachers, and a few parents, gathered for a local mental health awareness event. Clara had been invited by a friend from her community support group who had heard her speak during a virtual session and believed in her message. At first, Clara refused. "I'm not ready," she'd said. "I'm not a speaker. I'm just someone who survived." But the invitation sat with her. And eventually, she realized that she wasn't being asked to perform. She was being asked to be real, something she had practiced in silence for years. So, she said yes. And now, standing under the soft glow of the stage lights, she felt both terrified and powerful. A silence hung in the room, thick with anticipation. And then she spoke. Not from memory, not from a script, but from truth. She told them about the locker room whispers, the hallway stairs, the pain of feeling invisible in a world that never stopped watching. She spoke about the shame, the loneliness, the nights she questioned if waking up was even worth it. But more than that, she spoke about healing. She shared how journaling saved her, how therapy helped her unpack the layers of trauma she didn't even know she carried. She talked about the moment she realized her voice had power, the night she posted her story anonymously and someone wrote back, "You saved me." As she spoke, something changed. The room leaned in. People were listening, not out of politeness, but out of recognition. Faces softened, eyes welled with tears. Even the teachers looked shaken, as if they, too, had buried parts of themselves in silence. By the time she finished, the room was still. Then came the applause, not loud or wild, but sincere. A standing ovation, Not for a polished speech, but for a raw and honest soul brave enough to bleed in public. Later that night, a student approached her, barely 16, voice trembling. "Your story, it's my story too." "Thank you." That was when Clara understood. She wasn't just healing herself anymore. She was lighting a path for others to follow. And that moment, under soft lights, in front of 30 strangers, was the birth of something greater. A voice that could no longer be silenced. A mission that had just begun. From local stages to international audiences, Clara's mission spreads. What started in a small community center became a movement Clara never imagined she would lead. After her first public talk, Clara received a flood of messages. Students emailed her, asking if she could speak at their schools. Parents reached out to thank her for saying what their children couldn't. A teacher from another district asked if she could visit and talk to her students, many of whom were quietly suffering. Her story was being shared, reposted, reshared, passed from phone to phone like a lifeline. At first, it felt overwhelming. Clara was still healing, still carrying the weight of her own wounds. But every message, every handshake after a speech, every tearful thank you reminded her she wasn't doing this just for herself anymore. She began speaking in neighboring towns, then cities. Her talks weren't flashy. She didn't use slideshows or clever slogans. She didn't need to. Her power was in her honesty, the kind of raw, stripped-down truth that pierced through the noise and landed in the heart. People resonated with her not because she had all the answers, but because she had walked through the pain. She knew what it felt like to be 13 and hate your own reflection. She understood the crushing silence that follows humiliation. She remembered the numbness of pretending everything's fine while falling apart inside. Clara never pretended to be healed. She spoke as someone healing, and that made all the difference. A video of one of her talks, shaky, filmed on a student's phone, went viral. Within a week, it had over 2 million views. A well-known nonprofit in Europe contacted her. They were hosting a youth mental health conference and wanted her to be one of the keynote speakers. They had watched her video and saw something real in her. Clara couldn't believe it. Flying to another country to speak? Her, the girl who used to eat lunch in the school bathroom to avoid bullies? But she said yes. She stood on that international stage, lights bright, the audience quiet. The moment felt surreal, a full circle she never thought possible. As she spoke, sharing the same truths she always had, she realized something profound. Her pain had not been pointless. It had become her platform. From there, her mission only grew. Clara began partnering with schools, advocacy groups, and mental health organizations across the world. She launched workshops for teens. She trained educators. She even developed a mentorship program that connected survivors of bullying with peer support systems. Each city she visited, each story she heard, reminded her of the universality of pain and the universality of hope. What had once been shame was now purpose. What had once silenced her now gave her a microphone. Clara had gone from a forgotten girl in the corner of the classroom to a global voice for the voiceless, empowering others to rewrite their own stories, Clara's deeper purpose. With every speech Clara gave, she began to understand something powerful. Her role wasn't just to tell her story, it was to help others find the courage to tell theirs. After her talks, people would come up to her, some with trembling hands, others in tears. They weren't there just to say, "Thank you." They came to say, "That's my story too. I've never told anyone." In those quiet, vulnerable moments, Clara saw the deeper impact of her voice. It wasn't about being admired. It was about being real enough that others felt safe to drop their masks too. This realization shifted everything. Clara started ending her speeches not with applause, but with invitations, asking the audience, "What's the story you've been too afraid to share?" She reminded them that healing wasn't a straight line, and that pain doesn't disqualify someone from purpose, it prepares them for it. Soon, she began hosting private workshops specifically designed for teens and young adults who had experienced bullying, social rejection, or identity shame. These were safe spaces, no judgment, no pressure, just truth. She watched people who had been silent for years finally open up. Some couldn't speak at all and just cried. Clara understood, because she had once been that silent too. She brought in therapists and trauma-informed mentors. She built teams to train survivors on how to channel their stories into art, activism, and leadership. Her goal was simple but radical: turn survivors into storytellers and storytellers into changemakers. And it started working. A girl from one of her early workshops, painfully shy, bullied for her appearance, went on to create a short film about her experience. That film won a regional award. A boy who once avoided eye contact and admitted to suicidal thoughts became a student leader advocating for anti-bullying policies in his school district. Another young woman started a podcast about healing from trauma. Clara wasn't just speaking anymore, she was multiplying voices. The more stories were told, the more shame dissolved. That was the real revolution, not just changing individual lives, but shifting cultures. Clara knew the pain of isolation. Now, she was building community, one story at a time. She often said, "You don't need a stage to change the world. You just need the courage to be honest in front of one person." And people listened. For Clara, success wasn't about the size of the crowd. It was about the moment someone whispered, "Because of you, I believe I can heal too." She wasn't just a speaker anymore. She was a mirror, reflecting possibility back to people who had forgotten they ever had any. A life of purpose, Clara's legacy in motion. Clara never set out to be a symbol. When she stood in front of her bathroom mirror all those years ago, shoulders slumped, eyes tired from crying, voice nearly gone, she wasn't thinking about TEDx stages or international flights. She was just trying to survive another day, to breathe, to feel like she mattered. But somewhere between surviving and speaking her truth, something inside her shifted. What once felt like a scar became a signal. Her pain had not been pointless. It had carved a path, one lined with purpose, resilience, and the power to ignite change. Now, Clara wakes up each morning with clarity. She's flown to over 30 countries, standing in auditoriums, schools, and conference halls. She's looked into the eyes of thousands who once felt as broken as she once did. She's published a memoir that became a lifeline for readers across the globe. But even more than her public accomplishments, it's the quiet messages she receives that remind her why she keeps going. A mother who reads Clara's story and finally understands her daughter's depression. A teacher who changes the way they handle bullying in their classroom. A 15-year-old boy who says, "I didn't think anyone knew what it was like. Then I found you." Clara doesn't see herself as extraordinary. She sees herself as a mirror, someone who learned to reflect truth, even when it was uncomfortable, and in doing so, helped others reclaim their own reflection. Her mission now is legacy, not in the way most people define it, with statues, awards, or history books, but legacy in the most intimate, powerful way. Lives changed, hearts opened, voices set free. She's building programs in underserved communities to teach young people public speaking and storytelling. She funds scholarships for students who've overcome trauma and want to turn that into leadership. She mentors survivors of bullying, abuse, and discrimination, helping them transform silence into strength. Clara knows she won't be here forever, but she also knows she doesn't have to be. Because her voice, and more importantly, the voices she's helped amplify, will echo long after she's gone. That's the legacy she dreamed of, even when she didn't have the words for it. Not fame, not perfection, just truth, purpose, and a world where fewer people suffer alone.